Okay, good afternoon and good evening. We're now going to get started with today's program. Thank you for joining us as we host the 2023-2024 academic year's first installment of East Asia by the Book, the CEAS Author Talk Series sponsored by the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies. My name's Thomas Lamar, and I am Gordon J. Lang Distinguished Service Professor in Department of Cinema and Media Studies, EALC, and the College at University of Chicago. The Center for East Asian Studies, also known as CEAS, is a U.S. Department of Education designated National Resource Center at the University of Chicago. CEAS supports a variety of activities on campus and beyond to promote teaching, research, interdisciplinary scholarship, and greater public understanding related to the study of China, Korea, and Japan. If you want more information on the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies, as well as East Asia by the Book, the CEAS Author Talk Series, you can visit the CEAS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. These links will also be provided in the chat box. Tonight's program is co-sponsored with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, the Center's long-term partner and first non-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. We're encouraging book sales for this event to be made through Seminary Co-op. We encourage visitors to visit their website and support this unique cultural institution. You can learn more about the Seminary Co-op by following the link being provided in the chat box. A link to purchase tonight's book will also be made available in the chat box. So before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind everyone that we have a Q&A session following the discussion between myself and Olga, and that will follow this dialogue. So if you want to ask a question, just type your question into the Q&A box and we will gradually introduce the questions. So it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Olga Solovyeva, and she is currently an assistant professor of Slavic literatures and a research fellow at the Center for Excellence, Interacting Minds, Societies, Environments at the Nicholas Copernicus University in Turin. She's the author of two previous works, Christ's Subversive Bodies, Practices of Religious Politics, which came out from Northwestern University in 2018. And she's also the co-editor of Japan's Russia, Challenging the East-West Paradigm, which came out with Cambria Press in 2021. Tonight, of course, we're going to talk about a different book entitled The Russian Kurosawa, Transnational Cinema, or the Art of Speaking Differently, which was just recently published. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn to Olga and briefly introduce the book. It's nice, but I want to begin by asking a question about the framework of Russia or Russian. So the new historical perspective in this book is that of Japan's Russia. And Olga describes this quite nicely at various points in the book as Russia as an ideological synecdoche or Russia as subtext. For instance, at one point, she tells us that Kurosawa restores the Japanese tradition of social consciousness to himself through a Russian subtext. So I found this methodology really compelling as a point of departure. And I just wondered if you could share with us some background of how you arrived at such an approach, what kind of contribution you think it makes, and also potentially some of the difficulties you encounter with this method of Russia as subtext.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for this introduction. And I just want to start with briefly thanking my colleagues at the University of Chicago who were very welcoming and supportive of this book. And without the Japanologists at the University of Chicago, it wouldn't be really not possible. The Japan's Russia, I think, is a very important concept because Russia is usually seen as an antithesis to the West, yeah, or it is seen as a West, which is antithetical to Japan. And Japan's Russia, the concept of Japan's Russia allows for a transnational perspective, it raises the question what happens when two cultures come into a dialogue, and within this dialogue, new knowledge, new thought is being developed, which is actually transcends both cultures, which originally came into this dialogue. It allows us to avoid the binaries. It allows us to avoid the kind of antithetical thinking. And Russia and Japan is a very good example for this, because these two cultures historically have been so richly cross-fertilized, as historian Shoko Nisha has shown to us, that it provides a great model for thinking cultures which you think, are antithetical as kind of a hybrid. In it, I do think this concept also applies to other cultures. You can talk about Germany's France or France, America, and so on, when you think not through the kind of state borders and state national constructs, but through intellectual encounters among the intellectuals and ideas. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was very struck with the way you set up this methodology, because in effect, you're making Russia internal to Japan in a sense, right? You're not just saying this is between Japan and Russia, but you're pointing to a powerful set of tensions or contradictions within Japanese society between what you call Japan's Eurocentrism or Japan's Europe versus Japan's Russia. And so I wondered if that's something else you want to talk about, because this is an effort, I think, to transform the way in which we envision the political cultural landscape of Japan. And I don't know how far we would push this into, how you think about it in terms of tensions and contradictions or whatever your language would be. But I just would be interested in hearing you speak more about that.
I notice, when you grow up in Russia, when you're familiar with Russian culture, you noticed, in Russian culture is especially explicit, but it's actually specific, this type of discourse which differentiates Russia or local culture from the West, is very typical for Balkans, for example, but through Dostoevsky, it's best known to the Western readers. And I just realized that actually this differentiation is internal to Russia. It's not, when we talk about West, when the Russians talk about Russia in the West, they're actually talking not about the West, but about internal contradictions within Russia, And I noticed that in Japan, the Japanese intellectuals were very receptive to this type of differentiated argument, where the culture is understood through differentiations and folds, incongruities, conflicts within this culture itself. And it seems to me that when Japan was going through the Meiji Westernization, they were very sensitive, finding this discourse of differentiations of critical other to the West, which is still within the Western paradigm in Russia, And about Japan, I think, it captures something. It actually captures facts of Japanese culture, because Japanese culture, it seems to be so monolithic and seems to be so, formalized. At the same time, also oppressive, you can say, in certain respects. In the same time, this culture breeds a lot of resistance, a lot of resistance within itself to these structural pressures. And I think Japan's Russia allows us to see them. This is what Shoko Nisha's book did to me. After I read it, I started noticing phenomena for which there was no language. This all, alternative cultures of Japan, which is not just alternative cultures in terms of people who kind of live completely alternative lives. It is alternative cultures and thinking within the established structures of universities and publishing and intellectuals. It's not complete strangers, they're complete complete alternatives. It's actually the mainstream culture, which is actually understands itself in a different way. It just, I think, opens our eyes on something which you couldn't see because we didn't have language for it. Maybe it's a too long of a question, but over answer.
Well, yeah, and that would be interesting. I don't want to push you too far to speculate on this, but one of the things you do in this book, following Konishi Sho's work, is to really resituate Kurosawa on the side of anarchist socialism, or maybe just anarchist modernity. And that's a really interesting move because, you know, even though people are aware of traditions of anarchism in Japan, I would say they're largely neglected, sometimes ignored in the way people write about political history of Japan. So, yeah, when you say, you know, these weren't seen and there are ways of seeing them, you know, what kind of barriers do you think there are to reworking and recentering Japanese cultural and political history on a legacy of anarchism or anarchic socialism?
Yeah, so this is, I just can repeat that for me, Kanish's book made things visible. It provided vocabulary, it provided a lens for something which is there but didn't have language because our official language, our discourse is kind of operates along different lines, has different vocabulary. For Kurosawa, there was simply no language to describe what he was actually doing. And when I came across this whole discourse around Kurosawa, the most common debate is whether he is most Western or most Japanese, yeah, along this kind of very nationalist and essentialist lines, and it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and I just realized that actually he's neither Western nor Japanese, or he's both in the same way, because this Russian tradition of cross-fertilized Japanese-Russian, thought, anarchist thought, is actually something which is friendly to the West, but it's critical of the West. Yeah, it's not anti-Western, it's not Western. It's a different type of Westernized thought, but there was simply no language, and I do think people were caught in this debate because there was no visibility for this discourse, because historically it was pushed out by the Marxist discourse, by other vocabulary, by American presence in Japan, and so on. And I think it's a question of visibility and of language. This is what the books do. They create language and visibility for certain phenomena which were there, but we didn't have language to talk about them. And I think Sho Kanish's book that did that, and I tried to do it by putting Kurosawa in this context, describe Kurosawa in his different language.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the really lovely surprises of the book, but it's a surprise nonetheless, because most people would not think of a filmmaker like Kurosawa, who, as you point out throughout the book, really is into aesthetic control. Like, he's a certain kind of mastery of film technique that is so central to what he does. And so it's almost as if there's a kind of paradox. Like, how does one read that kind of authorial voice, or if you will, even a kind of auteur presence, a signature in film that is in a way so recognizably Kurosawa, with anarchist tradition, which, some would say is kind of against precisely those sorts of gestures. And yeah, I'll just leave it there. I think there's ways in which you deal with that effectively in the book, but I wanted to pose it as a question.
Yeah, but I think, anarchism is not anarchy, yeah? It is a set of philosophies, and this again, it is a gain for me of Kanish's book, that he showed that it's a consistent philosophy, which is practically oriented, which has its own theology, its own sociology, its own, economic views, and so on. It's not just kind of less of control. Yeah, it is discourse, but it's discourse which is structured. It has its own structure. The structure is more fluid. It was more open. It's horizontal and not vertical, but it's still a structure, yeah, and it's still a discourse. And what I'm trying to do, I'm just showing that how, or I tried to show, and some people might disagree with me, but I tried to show that what Kurosawa is doing, he responds to many attempts to revive this tradition in Japan after the war. Yeah, he makes his kind of filmmaking a kind of equivalent to attempts to bring back this pre-war grassroots democracy, not just as a historical phenomenon, but also as a set of ideas and values.
Yeah, and it seems like part of, because there's a lot of weaving in this book that's very deft, and I kind of hate to pull all these threads apart, but one of the important threads of this book really is the way in which Kurosawa addresses himself. And there are lots of, if you will, techniques of self that you evoke around not simply his films, but also his autobiography and other kinds of production. And we run into confession, conversion, redemption, conscience. And so, yeah, I wanted to just open up, get you to talk more about the fit between those kinds of techniques of self, which I think you quite nicely show belong to a kind of Tolstoyan tradition in Bethink Yourself, but how that becomes a kind of political method for your reading, but also, in what you see Kurosawa doing.
Yeah, my sense of Kurosawa after spending with him, 10 years of my life very closely, that he really wants to be conscious of Japan, bad conscience, maybe, yeah, of Japan in a way in which some other people wanted to be, like Tolstoy wanted and Dostoevsky wanted to be conscious of Russia, yeah. Or Thomas Mann wanted to be conscious of Germany, and who wanted to work through this, their countries and their cultures' difficult and painful moments through themselves as a medium, who were just stepping into this experience and, internalizing this culture, its burden, its guilt, its wrongs, and doing it through the medium of the self. And this is auteurism in the kind of big sense of the word. But yeah, I do think that in Pasolini, of course, yeah. So this is the people who use themselves in their biography and their life as a medium. In that sense, Kurosawa is a auteur, and he is willing to take this burden upon himself, and that's why we talk about Tolstoy and religion. Yeah, that's why this type of conscience has certain religious dimension, and Tolstoy kind of invented this dimension, and Japanese were very receptive to it. And Kurosawa, I think, was one of those people who, consciously or subconsciously wanted to be Tolstoy, cinematic Tolstoy of Japan, not in terms of imitation, but in terms of kind of weight which he wanted to carry and could carry. And we need such people, because it's a question of survival of culture. My idea isn't that he understood culture as something which somebody has to step in and take this burden and do this, and he was willing to do this. He wanted to be Japan, yeah?
Yeah, and I think they're, because you're persuasive, it's showing through this wealth of material, autobiography, but also interviews and the rest, that really is adopting something of those kinds of techniques itself from this Russian subtext. But I'm wondering how, and this is a big question, and I guess I can ask more detailed questions about the films, but how do you see those techniques of self acting as cinematic techniques? Like what is the connection between, if you will, the work on self and the work through art?
Yeah, but that's why I went to autobiography. I didn't plan to write about autobiography at the beginning. It was supposed to be just a book about films, but autobiography used as a background for certain films, as is usually used, until I realized how heavy is the burden that Kurosawa takes himself as a medium, and that this book is extremely important. It's a major philosophical and historical work, although it seems to consist of anecdotes. But how, in the word, there's specular, yeah, I'm using the Dumas term specular moment of autobiography, and specular has a visual aspect to it, yeah, where reflection and self-reflection are kind of visual moments, and they're also something which is speculative and relates to thinking. Seeing and thinking are closely interconnected, yeah, in a specular moment. And of course, Kurosawa has this image of the toad in a box, yeah, which he takes as an image of himself with this many, many mirrors. And then you can see in his whole body of work how his characters, how many situations in the films reflect on himself, on his image of himself, yeah? So his cinema becomes kind of a series of these mirror reflections of himself.
Yeah, I noticed in that respect. I mean, one thing really wonderful about the book that I don't want you to sell short is that you provide very, very detailed readings of individual films, sometimes through the thematics of political confrontation. But I noticed particularly, and I'll just use one example, although I could give more, but when you talk about technique in The Idiot, for instance, you observe something quite interesting and emphasize at the exclusion of flashback. And it's these moments in your reading of cinema that gives me the impression that you're addressing a kind of austerity of style that Kurosawa sets up for himself, that somehow his, if you will, auteur mode or his techniques of self, when they register in this filmic way, are often the way you described them, geared around, control's the wrong word, maybe something very austere. There's often something that's eliminated, right? So you can't necessarily read it in the film as simply, oh, he has this new device. It seems more that you have to read what he's deliberately removing from the scene. And I just wondered if that's something you could talk more about too.
Yeah, I think with The Idiot specifically, it's a method of making a film into historical reflection, yeah, of achieving certain objectivity, of keeping several layers of history and several temporal moments in one plane, in one shot, on one level, because flashback is usually separates the past and the present. Yeah, and I noticed that, kind of cinematically speaking, his major goal as a historian of Japan, a cinematic historian of Japan, to reflect on this them together within a shot. And I noticed how much he works with photography, with props, with costumes, to make sure that several historical layers are not disconnected, that they're present at the same time, at the same moment. And this is, in a way, very kind of Dostoevskian technique, very kind of epileptic technique when Dostoevsky, this kind of expansion of experiences, expansions of consciousness, but then he kind of reflects on what caused it. And Kurosawa wants to have this reflection always inscribed in the film independently from any kind of a subjective vision. And I think it characterizes him, his particular auteurism. Yeah, he doesn't try to absorb Japan to put himself in the foreground. He constructs himself through Japan, through Japanese history, through his family, through the history of ideas and the characters. He is actually, this is one of the way being Japan, where each film about this many layers of history which coexist. This is very, I found this technique actually quite unique.
Yeah, I quite appreciated your description of that. At one point in the book, you describe it as non-linear yet condensed historicity, that you describe as multiple planes of historicity within a single image. So, almost building on the kind of depth of field and depth of layers of action we associate with Orson Welles, but you're pushing it towards this sense that there are actually layers of historicity in the image itself. And I think it's great. I don't know if there's more you want to add to my description.
No, I think actually Orson Welles is a good parallel would be to this Kurosawa technique. I was very impressed when I realized that Kurosawa is so invested in photography, in historical photography, that he composes each image on the basis of photographs and also newspaper articles which he encountered. And I found historical photographs, and you in most cases, you can't tell apart if you don't know which is Kurosawa shot and which is a historical shot. But at the same time, he manages to bring into it, through costumes, props, and so on, several other historical layers, like in the lower depths. When he puts characters in the Tokugawa period costumes, but he turns them into rugs, and these rugs become a historical denominator between post-war poverty and the Tokugawa period poverty, and he plays with this ambiguity. And
Yeah, and it seems very important to your analysis that, as you're pointing out here, that these layers of historicity are never linear, that one cannot assemble a linear history or trajectory. And at one point in the lower depths, you even say that, one of his gestures is to constantly be breaking through all the layers, right? Like smashing right through them and then re-articulating a relation among them. And it makes me wonder, again, it goes back to the historical political context you're evoking and also him as an auteur, but like why, what is really at stake in articulating a kind of nonlinear history? Because you also remark it's not memory, right? Like one would think, okay, nonlinear history is memory. It's triggering of things in a nonlinear manner, but you're not going that route either.
Well, it is something, it's historical memory. It's collective memory, because flashback and techniques of flashback, they're always individual. He tries to create a collective memory. That's why he goes to these images of history which people remember, but remember them collectively. And I think this collective aspect of his cinema is very important. He really makes cinema for all the people, as he said. But I wanted to say that this non-linear historicity, it's also philosophical thinking and concept of time of the anarchism, as Shokanishi has shown it. Yeah, for me, it's important in this sense that it's not this kind of a linear teleological understanding of history. Yeah, it is understanding of history through the series of moments, and there's certain progress, but this progress always happens within and understood within this moment. It's movement from, it's series of, experience and feedback. And I do think it has something to do with responsibility to know that whatever you experience in this moment had history. Yeah, that this setting and what is happening to you now is conditioned historically, and you do it by bringing in these historical layers of photography into the conversation, as in the Idiot, this conversation in the poplar alley, poplar forest line, where Kameda and Ayako have conversation, and she asks him to confess, to tell her about his near-death experience. But this confession, or this conversation, existential conversation, very private conversation, very intimate conversation, traumatic, and so on, happens in this historical setting, which is so charged in its own way with the history of modernization, westernization, and colonialism, and so on, and war. Just this poplar alley, itself is already a historical testimony to so charged past. And then when you're bringing this confession in dialogue with this background and ask why it happens in this setting, it raises a lot of questions and a lot of responses and a lot of intuitive responses by the viewer, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question, and hopefully it won't be too long-winded, about these 4 films that you focus on primarily. No Regrets for Our Youth, The Idiot, The Lower Depths, and Darsu Uzala. It's when you get to the last film, because it's made in the 1970s and in a 70 millimeter format and color and so forth, that it's very, very different aesthetically. And you make a remark at that point. You say, well, for all that it's remarkably different in style, it's the same worldview.
Yeah.
And so this is interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, on the one hand, you do devote a lot of time to showing how different these films are. But at the same time, you do want to show how it's the same worldview. And yeah, I'd like to get you to talk more about that, like, in part, like what you see that's really different stylistically and otherwise in these films, but then also, why this worldview almost needs to work through multiple worlds in order to articulate itself.
Yeah, I think it's, you skipped the Kiro, 5 films.
Sorry about that. I forgot one.
But it's true, my conclusion is actually working through Kurosawa is that his black and white films are films where he deals with history. And his color films are the films when this history, because of the historical distance, they're later, they start in the 70s with the Descadent, they deal with the same topics, but they turn them into philosophy. They acquire a certain level of generality. Yeah, and so I would say in the color films, Kurosawa becomes a philosopher. And it's also happened to Godard. Similarly, maybe when you age, you start kind of thinking it's in more broader terms. But I would say that why the film is different, ideology is the same, because Kurosawa is the same, but he's an artist and he explores new techniques. Yeah, he wants to start experimenting with color. He discovers color for himself. He resisted for a long time, but then he kind of yields, but he wants to do something creative. He discovers new format. He discovers new techniques. And as an artist, you want to experiment with new material, but at the same time, it is the same artist as a person, yeah, as somebody who's still, rooted in the same system of values. And that's why you can say that the Descadent is a more general version of the lower depths. And the Dessous Zala is harks back to many post-war ideas which he couldn't realize, and so he certainly could. But for me, in the Soviet Union, he could, yeah, because he has this plan to make this film already in the late 40s. And he couldn't realize it for different reasons. And for me, it was impressive that he remembered this idea, and his desire to do Dessous Zala survived almost 30 years. And then he returned to it whenever he had a chance. And for me, actually, it's a proof how consistent and serious and is this embrace of these philosophical premises, which I tried to show, yeah, because people will often say, okay, if somebody, makes a gesture after the post-war that he, turned from, kind of, let us say, collaborator into an ardent Democrat, is it honest or it's not, or it's just opportunism, And it's very clear that he is very consistently for 30 years adheres to the system of values and to the sense of guilt, which makes me which makes one take it seriously. Yeah, it's not just opportunistic moment after the war. It continues until basically he dies. So I take it as a proof of seriousness of this philosophy, which he embraces.
Yeah, I mean, reading your account, one almost gets the impression that a certain kind of fixity, a certain almost stubbornness or unwillingness to change becomes in itself a kind of resistance, right? As if saying, I won't move on, I won't let go of this question. I keep seeing, there's something about even your presentation of Kurosawa that invites that kind of reading.
Yeah, but at the same time, he becomes more explicit about certain things, or actually more implicit, more explicit. Yeah, for example, when you look at this parallel with this blockbuster by Watanabe, the great emperor, the Emperor Meiji on the Great Russo-Japanese War. If you, I think, take this film next to Dessous Zala, and then he puts Dessous Zala, the indigenous nomad in Siberia, into this kind of a prominent position, which was reserved for the emperor. I do think it's kind of radical move, and it's kind of in certain way. But it's of course my reading of it. Maybe it's maybe it's a coincidence.
Well, raise a question for me about how you see, again, the relation among these films, because you do spend a lot of time in the book, providing very specific reading of these 5 films and distinguishing them from one another. And I just wondered how you think about the relation between them. You're sort of already talking about that, but is he experimenting with different ways of doing something and feeling it doesn't work and moving on? Or is he kind of succeeding with one thing and then not wanting to do it anymore? Like when I read your book, I get the impression that every film just works in its own terms. So what promotes this kind of difference, this literally a series of Kurosawa films rather than just 3 or something?
Well, I think it's the history itself, yeah. For me, it was also important to show that Kurosawa participates, his cinema participates in the discourse of his time. Yeah, he's not just making films. He understands himself as an intellectual, and he is an intellectual who reads philosophy, who reads history, who follows arts, who reads literary criticism, he reads newspapers, he participates in the discourse as a public intellectual. Yeah, he gives his replique, he gives his response to what is going on, but he does it via cinematic medium. And his films, and I'm trying to show, I don't know how convincing it is, but I'm trying to show how his films correspond or happen at the same time as certain debates are happening in the in the Japanese society, in the intellectual debates, yeah, how lower depths responds to this debate about beggar photography and re-emergence of nationalism, how Ikiro responds to the certain entertainment culture which is on the scene, about which Kurosawa reads and which he experiences in the streets, and all this joints and American entertainment culture coming in. So I'm showing the connection of the idiot as this kind of attempts to work through the implication of religion or Buddhism in Zen Buddhism in the nationalist enterprise and so on. Yeah, I have a lot of references to contemporary intellectual context. And seeing this myself, I understood that Kurosawa participates in it. It's not, cinema is not just happens in the, cinematic theater, that he really responds. And I don't know if his responses are registered by the intellectuals, by the artists, by the writers, I think they were, actually, if you think about his collaboration with Takemitsu and other people who, Oe comments on Kurosawa, Kurosawa comments on Oe. So it looks like he is in dialogue with people who are not filmmakers. And this is what interests me about his cinema, and what is basically was the goal of my book. The larger goal is to show that, this is the cinema which is the part of the intellectual discourse and debate of the time. And that's why the changes which you see, are continuity on the one hand, but also changes, because the discourse changes, the problems change, the takes on these problems change. And that's why from year to year to year, you can follow how he responds to different type of intellectual and cultural events in his country. Yeah.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, this is kind of a bluntly political question related to No Regrets for Our Youth. I mean, I think your reading is very persuasive about, Yukie going off at the end to form an anarchist socialist collective or to join one. But what always struck me strange about that film within its historical setting is what you describe as this kind of anarchic socialism sort of meshes with the vision of SCAPS, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, Douglas MacArthur, who also saw the future of Japan being a deindustrialized agrarian folk. And and I would qualify his form of anarchism as anarcho-fascism. So like, it's a very fine line, but I'm just wondering, how you think these Kurosawa films negotiate that. And I think it's a very contemporary kind of political issue too, right? Like, what does anarchism do? If it's not aligned with socialism, does it align with fascism? Where is Kurosawa in that kind of debate?
Well, but this is exactly where the Russian context comes in, yeah? Differentiation which comes through these historical layers we talked about, yeah? If there would be no Mussorgsky in the soul, which brings in the whole layer of the populist, narodnik, Kropotkinist, Tolstoyan agrarianism, yeah, you could read it in you could read it differently. And I do think that Russian context and subtext creates this differentiation, which is very fine line, as you said, yeah? Because he says, okay, yes, it is agrarian, but it's that agrarian, yeah? It is agrarian tradition of Tolstoyism, It is agrarian tradition of Miyazawa. It's agrarian tradition of as Kropotkin described it, of the Russian Narodniks, when they just went, this intellectual young people who went to the countryside, wanted to make themselves useful, wanted to learn from the people what are their concerns, and wanted to do something concrete on the ground. So I do think that the signaling of the Russian context put the things right, where he does takes advantage of definitely of this American agrarian reform and constitution and women's rights and everything, which is brought by Americans, but he kind of brings in certain corrections. He said, yes, we need democracy, but it should be this type of democracy, not that type of democracy. Yeah. So in that sense, Russian subtext brings in this differentiation for me.
Yeah, and it was something that I had a question about. I think you make it implicit in the book that, you know, democracy, as you're talking about it, is a certain model of democracy, well, like clearly not liberal democracy, and
not livable.
Not liberal democracy.
Not liberal. No, not liberal. No,
it's
no,
not,
no,
it's
not,
not a
not
North
liberal.
Atlantic liberal democratic model. So, but I think this kind of issue that you're dealing with in a really complex way came out for me a lot in the chapter on The Idiot, because, as you say, a lot of people said, oh, Kurosawa is the only one who really understands Dostoevsky. And yeah, Dostoevsky is really hard to read in an anarchist socialist tradition. You're showing how that works, but I kind of want to solicit you to talk a little bit more about that.
But I even make a connection to this. What is to this anarchist from the Akuzaki, whatever his name, the Emperor's Army Marches On. I was actually surprised. For me, it was a discovery, actually, how similar Kurosawa's the confession scenes or execution description of execution scene, how this reverberates is what Okuzaki was doing when he was trying to trace the perpetrators of crimes in the Japanese army and make them confess in their living rooms. I do think this connection to Emperor's Army Marches On actually brings it out. Yeah, it's a scandal. It is scandal to make people. So Dostoevsky in Scandal has something anarchist in it. Yeah, you do something which you shouldn't do. In Dostoevsky, it has a pathological and philosophical meaning. He needed certain presentation techniques, but Kurosawa uses it to address the topics which can be addressed otherwise, and he uses Dostoevsky exactly to break certain taboos. He uses Dostoevsky as a taboo breaker, and I think he does it very effectively as a cinematic technique. But we have a historical example of an anarchist who did it actually in real life. Yeah, it was also a scandal, and.
Yeah, on that heading, it's something you don't really refer to as such in the book, although it is on the edges of everything you're talking about. A lot of times when people try to talk about Russia and Japan and sites of conversion, they talk about non-dualism or non-dualistic forms of thinking. And you sort of brought that to the fore, but you never use that language or even that conceit. And yeah, it's something I wanted to hear more about. Like, why not begin there, right? Which is a fairly commonplace point of departure.
Well, I don't know if it's, I'm not familiar actually with this, that Russia and Japan don't think in dualistic terms, because this whole discourse on, whether Russia is West or not West is very dualistic. yeah, all this kind of differentiation discourse, Russia versus West. You can't imagine anything more dualistic than this. And this is for exactly what Japanese fall for, yeah, because they want to understand how to position themselves within the Western paradigm, which they want to adapt on the one hand, but they don't want to lose their individuality at the same time, and how to work through this. And Russia is kind of a good example where we're returning to the same point where we started. Russia offers this kind of discourse of differentiation, and because this discourse is mobile and because it's fluid, it comes across as not dualistic, yeah, because you have this constant back and forth, yeah. And this is what I also, because you asked before how this anarchism and Kurosawa's method work, what is interesting about actually anarchism and cultural anarchism, or as a philosophical system, it's actually not really a system. Yeah, it's a fluid discourse which is always based on a feedback loop in response to the practice and experience. It doesn't become a dogma, and I do think there's something cinematic about it. Yeah, because cinema is a fluid discourse, moving image, moving discourse. And Kurosawa actually, if you take his all films in one meta text, which deals with certain set of anarchist ideas and values and so on, his whole life work can be seen as working through these ideas in a fluid cinematic way, which always responds to the moment and what is necessary and what is going on. Yeah, this fluidity, this mobility, this flexibility is there, and it's, I think, something very cinematic about it, and it's not binary and not dualistic, but not in a kind of essentializing way.
Yeah, that's a bit what I was thinking about. It often appears more in context when people are dealing with, say, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and religion, and you gloss that a lot in your account of Tolstoy and religious sentiment as it enters Japan. And you were also referencing Kurosawa's, interest in Buddhism. So precisely, right, that non-dualism wouldn't be the opposite of dualism, but a different way of inhabiting it. Although, that's such a strong tradition, I could see why you'd avoid it in a certain way as well. But one of the things I just wanted to ask, and this is a curiosity question, that when I think of those Russian writers in particular and their impact on Kurosawa, it really makes me look at animals quite differently, because as we know, Tolstoy was one of the people who today is credited with starting animal rights movements, of promoting veganism. Dostoevsky is known as well for the unusual position of animals in his literature. And you, particularly in Ikiru, you like have the dog, like they're staging something like this, and you also have the rabbits. And I just
Yeah. But those artificial rabbits.
yeah, I just wondered if I could,
Rabbits.
get you to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, but this is actually also, this kind of a, anarchist philosophy where to go from the marginal and less significant, yeah, changing the hierarchical values, yeah, in making this fluffy rabbit the moment of this man's conversion and complete, redemption. As rabbit becomes this redemption figure, but at the same time, it's a rabbit whom you see on the moon in the Chinese mythology, of philosophical figure at the same time. Yeah, and the dog who enjoys the steak, which the man who dies of cancer can't enjoy, kind of represents this creaturely moment of life which he's losing. But I do think that, the attention to children, adapting children's point of view, adapting this animal's point of view, communication with nature, it's a way of criticism, of drawing attention to other things, into other forms of knowledge and other forms of thinking. And I think it goes along with the general agenda, you know, of the general set of values, which wants to rethink, you know, social communication among people and communication between people and nature on different terms.
Yes, that really comes out clearly in the analysis.
But also at Hartman, you know, if you think about Hartman's pictures at the exhibition, yeah, that he chooses the most weird and awkward and insignificant objects to write this music piece. Yeah, it was also very much of this kind of a narodnik gesture to say, you know, like, we don't accept your official set of values. We rethink it through other objects. But also philosophically, we have it with Siegfried Krakauer. We have to with philosophical essayism of the Germany 1920s, when they started, you know, thinking about objects and thinking about space and time by describing a glass or a teapot. You know, Krakauer has, I think, a piece about the teapot, and the whole philosophy of cosmos developed around this teapot. So it's kind of a way to break the constraints of the dominant discourse into something new. It's also kind of alienation effect, yeah.
Well, I could go on talking with you forever about this, but we have reached the moment where I want to open it up to Q&A, and we have two people post questions, one anonymous, one named. There's Anna Tropnikova, and we can invite Anna Tropnikova to join us to pose the question live, if they would like.
Hi, thank you so much. Give me a second. I can't quite turn the camera on. But I wanted to ask a little bit about, well, first of all, thank you, Professor Solovyova, for this pertinent comment that starts getting us to think about films not in but within national canons of films, which is, I think, a very old approach that needs to go. And Kurosawa is one excellent example of why this approach needs to go. But I wanted to ask a little bit about some of the discrepancy between what Kurosawa might publicly say his films are doing, and sometimes he's reticent, and other times he will explicitly claim, you know, Dersu Uzala is ecological, for example. Was it perceived ecologically anywhere, according to you, according to your research? Could we link maybe an eco-criticist thread all the way back to No Regrets for Our Youth? Those are some of the things that I was thinking about, but I might also ask you to ponder about, just on their own terms, could Kurosawa's films be something else, even outside of the philosophical creator? Thank you.
Yeah, I do think, you know, he said that there's something ecological. When was it? It was in the 80s. It was very late. Yeah, I don't know if it was received that way at that time. I think it's a little bit earlier, but it definitely can be read through the eco-criticism, yeah, today. Yeah, I didn't guide myself with what Kurosawa said about his films. It was interesting. I tried to be in dialogue with this, but it was not the, you know, where I was looking for kind of solutions to the problems which he raises, not to his own explanations. Yes, we usually don't take this self-criticism very seriously in this way, because also a lot of creative production happens unconsciously, as we know, and so on. Yeah. But there's certain how we know what Kurosawa really meant. It's of course a question of interpretation. Yeah, and I would be I'm very open to different interpretation of his films if somebody can come up with something convincing. But I was for a long time trying to kind of go to the films themselves to see what the films actually say and do. And so in the conclusions, I in my book.
Thank you so much.
Did you have any
I'm
more?
not sure I answered your questions. But
I think you did when it comes to, I'm sorry, Professor Lamar. I think you did answer when it comes to saying that, you were writing from a what the films are doing perspective first, and then basically not really relying on that public comment about the films that Kurosawa might make. So I think that does answer it.
yeah,
obviously-
I noticed that his autobiography is very, very constructed
Right.
and consists mostly out of quotations and intellectual allegories. Everything he writes about his parents and so on, his brother, and it looks like he switches between his own and his brother's personality. But it goes along with this topic Tom and I talked about history and his particular authorism, where he wanted to construct himself as representative and being typical representative of Japanese, not just history, but Japanese intellectual history. He almost creates this kind of a intellectual history of Japan from at least, Tokugawa period, when you take into account his family history, which he tries to reconstruct, and all the way into 90s. Yeah, there's so many references to literary sources and debates and characters and writers that it becomes very, very clear that what he writes there, it's certain kind of historical self, the self which he constructs as a collective and historical self. Yeah, and maybe historical self not of the whole Japan, but of a certain, of Japan's democratic descent. This is how he wants to see himself on the basis of the references which he brings in.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that question before turning to another, I mean, it's one of the questions that constantly emerge for me, like when you talk about Kurosawa resisting making certain kinds of gestures through film technique. Is he resisting what his contemporaries are doing? Or is, particularly when I think of removal of flashback and subjective shots, I think of a certain kind of Japanese cinema. Resistance to certain techniques can become very gendered, for instance, right? Like it can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm sure those thoughts crossed your mind when you were when you were working on this.
Yeah. No, it is it is choices which signify, not only presence of certain techniques, but also absence of certain techniques and absence of certain, like this historical gap in the Zala and so on. He signifies through ellipses and through, but those are, for me, part of the language of cinema which he invents, of intellectual language with which he responds to cultural situation, including the cinematic situation of his time. Those not are just his personal predilection. This is my point. It's a response. It's a conversation with what is going on around him. And you can't write about Kurosawa, maybe about anyone, without looking at the context with which they engage, and especially him, because he saw himself as a public intellectual.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to another question and I will read it. It's posed by anonymous attendee, so I'll let them remain anonymous. And the question is about adaptation. And this person writes, I'm intrigued by your mentioning Kurosawa and Pasolini together, for both are known for their adaptation of works from long ago and far away, such as the Idiot, Ikiru, Throne of Blood, Ran, Medea, Decameron, Canterbury Tales. Does adaptation mean the same thing or have similar functions for both directors?
Yeah, this is a good question because Pasolini also went to the classics, yeah, to certain classics, and I have worked in adaptation a lot, and I would say that choice of the text matters, always matters, and I would say yes, they are similar in that they both working through the intellectual history of their countries and a Western tradition, and of Pasolini was actually also a very avid reader of Dostoevsky and used Dostoevsky scandal technique for his own scandals. But yes, both of them are reworking the what we call cultural heritage of their respective cultures, but also of the Western culture in general, because through adapting Russian sources, Kurosawa also responds to the Western intellectual tradition. And of course, Pasolini, he doesn't have so much of an Asian presence in his cinema, but he works through the Western tradition and through the same problems of the Western tradition, which Kurosawa works through. In that sense, I do think that adaptation has the same intellectual and cultural value, although techniques are different. Yeah.
There are no additional questions, so I will simply conclude the dialogue. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the dialogue, and a huge round of applause for the author, Olga Solovyeva, and we hope that everyone enjoyed the discussion. If you're interested in previously held book talks, including this one, please visit the SEAS YouTube channel where there are numerous recorded events from years past that are available for public viewing. A direct link to the channel will also be placed in the chat box. So thank you everyone, and have a wonderful day or night, depending on where you are.